This is, of course, the cover of the book. And it's kind of fascinating for Liz and myself to be presenting our books tonight, because there, as Mirko mentioned, there are many parallels. First of all, we were both young women with no requisite experience for doing what we did, and those experiences were 50 years apart. We made, both of us, major interventions in New York City, and our books are accounts of what, who, why, as first-person experiences. I as for Seagram, and Liz as the architect with Rick Scofidio beginning, and then with Renfro as after 2004. So the time frame for my book is 1950 to 2001. So it's a real look at how the building sat in New York, what the attitude was towards building in New York, and then the design issues that were related to the building, both of Mies and of Philip Johnson. And then, of course, the question of the building in the city and the art, and the legal questions, taxation, the question of landmarking, and the question of custodianship of the building, and then the question of economics and how that deeply affected, I'm not going to talk about that tonight really, but how that deeply affected what was happening in New York and in the area around the Seagram building, and indeed the Seagram building itself. That is Samuel Braun from my father, and he was the client de jure. I was the client de facto. I was, of course, the person who convinced my father that he had to do a great building, that it was a period when architects were the brilliant architects in the world, or architects that were as important to their period as architects of the Renaissance. And I say that because these were periods of very different changes in society. Of course, the Renaissance was a very big change from looking at God as a man shivering down there while God reigned over everything, a man taking over. And now it was, of course, in the 1950s, the huge change of industrialization that finally became expressed itself in cities. Another sort of aspect of the clients. This was a meeting of the Building Management Association, and the people in this photograph, he was Louis Schiff, he was the head of leasing for the Seagram building. This was Slater, what was his first name? He was the head of the building committee. You could see what an unpleasant man he was. This is, of course, me. Philip Johnson is here. Gene Summers, who was Mies's right-hand man, very, very young, had just gotten out of the army. Dick Foster, who was Philip's right-hand man. Mies. Eli Kahn, who was the associate architect in the project, also not a great person. This was the clerk of the works, who was, he had worked on, he collected, what do you call it, rugs, sort of the past. I thought that was very retardataire, and he was very retardataire. This man was John Handy, and he was an assistant to my father, and he was wonderful. He believed in what I wanted to do, and he mentored me because I'd never, had gone out before a group of businessmen and talked to them or anything. And so he mentored me and to get onto the building committee. My father didn't put me on that. I fought my way onto it. And so he was really very helpful. And all these other people, they all look pretty grim. They're all they're members of this building management association. And I was very nervous at that meeting because I'd gone away in the summer of 1955 for a few weeks on a vacation. And when I came back, this guy and this guy spoke to this guy, and they spoke to the client somewhere along the tower, or to Seagram, anyway, whoever. No, they probably spoke to this man. And so they had this meeting because Mies had a 3x5 building with a 1x3 spine behind it. And they thought that didn't work at all. In fact, they thought that Mies was a child. He'd done this simple building in Chicago, but he did not know the complexities of building in New York. So they made a new design. And so they made a building that was 4x5. And you know, if you could imagine that, a very different kind of building. So I went down to their office and I said, look, you were hired to work as associate architects, and your job is to do the working drawings of the building Mies designed. And what's his name? Kahn said to, Eli J. Kahn said to me, oh, we didn't change anything. You couldn't see the difference. There were many, you know, so these were kind of people where one had to overcome. This is the building in Montreal that was built by my father in 1927-28, and actually was first built on the left, and then the right was added to it the year afterwards. And this was his idea of heaven, I think. And I thought it was something we didn't want. And in New York, well, first of all, they had rented, Seagram had been there for many years, in the Chrysler building, which was a kind of wonderful building. And they couldn't stay there anymore, so they rented space in another building. I'll show it to you in a minute. But finally decided on the site of Park Avenue. And Park Avenue was called Park Avenue just because you see the park in the center. It was actually an open railroad cut originally. And the building where Seagram is now was the Steinway factory in the end of the 19th century until 1913 when the, well, I'll tell you about that in a minute, when this building here was built, the apartment house. And so that's the site that Seagram was on then. And of course, this was all happened when they filled in the open cut. And here's Park Avenue. And the zoning changed everything. Oops, why did that do that? I don't know. So that you, oh, I see what happened. I pressed the button myself. There we are. No, I'll have to do it this way. Okay. There, I won't do it again. So you can see Lever House was here, and that was about all when we were started. This is a drawing of 75 by only one contractor. So you see there was a huge change in the whole area. And the buildings that were built like this. And this is the building in which Seagram took space. I don't think that Samuel Bronfen had ever been in the building, and he eventually went there and said, oh my God, this is awful. He was used to something that had a much greater character to it, and of course they had to get out of the lease. They leased, I don't know, 6 or 7 floors, but this was the kind of ziggurat that actually was created in that area, and quite interesting because this was an area in which, let's say from 50th to 57th, and from Lexington and 3rd to 6th Avenue, these were the kind of buildings that were really being built. And this, of course, was the site that the Seagram building was on, and this was this building, McKinney and White's wonderful racquet and tennis club, which was fortuitously across the street from the site. It was a brilliant site. It was a wonderful site. And here you see the Lever House right next to it. So this is pretty well the situation that existed without this, oops. I don't think that this building here was built then. What can you say? The people who were, there were all sorts of ideas about who should be the architect. It was all related to commercial companies that were real estate companies. And the architect of this ghastly building, or the designer of it, was Charles Luckman. And Charles Luckman had been the CEO of the Lever House. And so this man was the chief salesman of Seagram's. And so a salesman knows a salesman. And Charles E. Luckman was really a salesman. He had some good idea about the Lever House, and that one gives him credit for. But he decided this absolutely abhorrent building. And I've been discussing this with my father for some time. And I said no. No, and wrote a very long letter, which is actually in the book, reproduced in the book. And I came back. I was living in France as an artist, and I came back to decide on to look for the architect. That wasn't immediately why I came back. I came back because I was going to do something, and with the combination of Lou Crandall, who was the head of the Fuller Company, which is the largest company in real estate, and my father knew the head of the company, the CEO, who was a terrific man, and I was sent to see him, and he was the one who sort of backed me. And I think that, to have an unpracticed person who never had any business experience or anything else really work on a building, I think that by knowing that Lou Crandall was there, at least gave my father some assurance that if anything went wrong, it could be caught. And so anyway, I made I went for 6 weeks to research who could work on the building, and it was interesting. Eero Saarinen, he was a great list maker, and so he devised a way of looking at that. He said there would be those who could and shouldn't, like all those big horrible buildings, Kahn and Jacobs for one, and also the architects of Lever House, which was not Skidmore, which was very much of a Bauhausian building, but not one could do something better than that. And then those who could and shouldn't, and those were the younger people. And then there were those who could and should, and those were very few. Mies, Le Corbusier, and Wright was not really in there because he was kind of a great architect of the 19th century. He was not a contemporary person. But anyway, I went to everybody's office, talked to them, and finally came back and told Mr. Crandall of the Fuller Company that I thought of Mies, and he said I thought it should be Mies, and he agreed. And so, I get confused with what I'm pushing here. And so that is the model of the Seagram building, which Mies worked on very quickly. And there's interesting discussion in the book, like from letters I have that I wrote to a friend, and I kept copies of. I should say I had a very good assistant who kept copies from it. And so that I describe how Mies proceeded. I'm not going to talk about that here because that I don't think I want to, but. I don't think, I can only do so much. But, so what happens here is this is a new building on 1 acre of land. The plaza in front is a half acre, and it's about 990 feet back, and then the building itself is about that also. And what is also interesting about my choice of Mies was that two things. One was all the younger architects were always saying, I do this differently from Mies or that differently from Mies. So everybody was always talking in reference to Mies. And secondly, when I went to see Mies in Chicago and saw his buildings at 860 Leuchter Drive, they are such palpably impressive buildings. You see them and you sort of go like that. They're so simple and so wonderful. And Mies himself was a very generous person. I think generosity is a huge importance in people who are architects and clients. And So as Liz will talk about the whole process of how they got chosen to do the Lincoln Center, which is extraordinary. And so I want to go on now to the issue of the public space. I keep on thinking, that says public space. Now here is the Seagram building, and I just want to say, this is the line of that makes this is the 3 bay by 5 bay, and this is the 1 bay by 3 by 1 bay, and then this is that bustle in the back, and these are where these great rooms are, the dining, what now became the Four Seasons restaurant. This is the bar and grill room, and this is the pool room, and here sits the fantastic Picasso. And so these pools, Beast designed those, and the trees, and this is a glass enclosure here. And so what is so extraordinary is this is completely permeable. You go up, well, first of all, you're way over here, you're at the McKim White building, and you across Park Avenue, and then you have this broad space of the Park Avenue, and then you have this great plaza, and you could walk through. You see, you don't stop. Usually, if you're in an office building, you stop here, and it's a cul-de-sac. But you go through, and you could go here, or you could go that way, or you could go around that way again. And so movement was a hugely important thing to me. And these photographs are in color. They're photographs that I commissioned Richard Pear to take, because nobody's ever looked at the constituent parts of the plaza in Seagram building. And this he took from a setback on the building just to the north of the Seagram building. And these trees, they were originally weeping beeches, and they didn't hold up in New York, so these are catalpa trees. And here you see the beginning of the spine, and there's a reason for why this is marble, but I won't go into it now. This is just under where the benches are, and the trees, and people stop and talk, and I think you can go ahead. Oh, that's good. And this is, when you're in that area, the kind of greenness of the place, the openness of the place, the fountains. This is the view again from there, these great benches here. It's amazing. There is not a railing at the Seagram building. And Mies said, well, if a railing has to be 3 feet or 3'6", why don't we make the benches that wide, and then we don't have to have the railing? And the city agreed. And then you have, this kind of great open space. And of course, what's very important is the enclosure of it by buildings to the north and to the south. And you see, this is what Mies set the building back, because he said, you walk down Park Avenue and you can't ever see the building. Well, here they are, all aligned up on the sidewalk. And indeed, you can't see them. And you can see all the people sitting here on the plaza. Over here, the kind of more quiet place. So that there are all these kind of various spaces. This is, again, under, I don't know, it's just sort of beautiful, the quality of the light. And looking towards the McKim White building over here. That's, of course, a totally new building. And then just looking at this is kind of marvelous, abstract kind of, Mies was amazing at making architecture out of necessity. These are the air intakes for the basement, for air conditioning. And just imagine that without that, it just adds such a marvelous extra dimension. This was looking, I guess, yes, this was looking at 53rd Street. And this question of reflection that, of course, is so marvelous and you see people, again, sitting here on the bench reading. And that's a quiet place where people in sort of a more private area. And this was, I think Richard told me, was the hottest day of the year. And what's very important about this is the generosity of the space in front of the building, and then this great space is the building. And, you know, people sit on those steps. This photograph is going down 53rd Street. And here the building, I call it well, Liz calls them a plinth, what the Lincoln Center sits on. And it's a very interesting thing because she will say that was a major stumbling block at Lincoln Center of why it didn't work, why the public space didn't work. But at Seagram's it works wonderfully. So this is an interesting discussion for Liz and I to have. But here, you see people can always see the trees and then there's the restaurant, the Four Seasons, the brasserie that Diller Scofidio actually were the architects of after the Philip Johnson's thing had a problem. And then right down here, I don't know why the slides cut off, but this is actually the mark of the building line. So you know, had this kind of very graciousness of actually, the building could have come out to here and it could have come all to here. And this is, of course, this wonderful bench and the pools. And here, what is so great is the permeability of the view from inside outside. So here, you're outside the building, you see the fountain reflected in it, but you also see the wonderful sculpture over the bar area and the back of the room. So what is hugely important in the Seagram building is the fact that you have this long, low piece at the back, the three-story, it's almost like a building lying down, and that you always see life in the building. That it's not a building that you go into and you go into the elevator and it's sucked up. Think of all the buildings you've gone into, office buildings, they're all like that. And so this was a major aspect of it. And this is actually where you walk in and you see the curtains, these wonderful curtains, which you'll see in a minute. Oh, here they are. So this is the magic curtains, which are chains of aluminum, gold things. Philip Johnson did this space, but you see here are those fountains again. So from inside, from outside, you see the trees on the plaza. And of course, this changes with the quality of the light during the day. And this is where you see again, the permeability of the space. And here, this is the entrance to the Four Seasons from inside the building. And here you see reflected in the glass here, the McKimmey White building across the street, but you also see the Picasso. And this marvelous Picasso, here you see the building reflected actually on the front of the building at the entrance. We were, 100 and something feet back. And the other image, and this wonderful painting, it's not a painting, it's a curtain that Picasso did in 1919 for Diaghilev ballet. And I discussed this a great deal, identify lots of things about it, the history of it, and how it came about, and in the book. And it was actually cut down, it's 20 by 20, it fits there so extraordinarily into the space of the building, and of course its tonalities with the travertine, it's just quite magic. And this, this is what he's represented. So Diaghilev cut this down, cut it out. He needed money, and so that was sold a long, long time ago, and we finally bought it in 1957, I think. And this is the Four Seasons grill and bar room, and you could see kind of the veiling that these marvelous curtains give you. And this was Philip Johnson's brilliant solution to how to lower the space, the feeling of space at the bar, because the clients want that. A room that is square, almost, and half the height. It's 103 bays, so that's 90 feet by 90 feet. So it's an amazing space, and then, you know, how to modulate that space was Philip did that brilliantly. This was a sculpture by, I can't think of his name, isn't that terrible? Oh, it's terrible, I can't think of his name. Anyway, there's a great deal about how he designed that, and we commissioned that, Philip and I. And then, of course, this just gives an atmospheric sense of a person being there. And this is the pattern that, you know, for hanging that, which we redrew from the blueprints in the building. And this is looking up at these wonderful rods, they're bronze rods. And I still can't think of the artist's name. And here, of course, you see going from the pool, from the bar room into the pool room, the Picasso. Wonderful photograph by Ezra Stoller. Now I'm going to discuss again the artwork, but this is again the program for a building. A building is not just an object you sit in space. A building has to be, if it makes any sense in a city at all, it has to take in the area around it. It has to be wonderful to go into. It has to be wonderful to be in. It has to be wonderful to pass by. And the art, we really involved in the offices of Seagram and in the Four Seasons and on the plaza. There were, you know, there were permanent works there, but on the plaza the works changed for various reasons, which I can go into or won't go into, we'll see. But this is an Olmec head. That was on the plaza. Of course, you could only recognize the Seagram because of that. And of course, that was one of the problems. Later on, I was asked to put a permanent sculpture on the plaza, and Mies sort of decided on Moore, and Henry Moore, and he came over and he said, no, he didn't want to put a sculpture there. There's a letter about this explaining that in the exhibition in the hall corridor, in the hall galleries, the hall windows. But here, of this building, but he said, you know, you're never going to see the sculpture really against the Seagram building. You're always going to see it against the buildings on both sides, up and down. And many of these images show this. And what became wonderful was to be able to change the sculpture on the plaza, because, you know, when you have something new, there's a relationship between the object or the sculpture, the work there, and the building, which changes, and you look at it anew, and it doesn't become, you know, kind of a static situation. And it's a very tiny place like this. I think that's important. And this was the building to the north was. I think it's building. Photographs turned around. Building to the north was knocked down by then, and so there's this great sculpture. Sometimes I forget the name of the sculptures, and it's ridiculous. This was by Smith. Kiki Smith's father, what was his name? Gordon Smith? No. Anyway, and here I show the sculpture being installed, and of course you see it against the McKimmey and White building here, this dreadful piece over there. And you see it's going up, and that's what's sort of a more permanent view of it. This is, I didn't write down the names, and I can't think of anybody's name tonight. But there we are, and he was actually installing this piece on the plaza himself, and it was so, you know, these became events, and people could watch them, and it was quite very exciting to see the artist working, and this, of course, was his final piece, and again, I'm just not going to tell you anybody's name tonight. And this is a wonderful photograph taken by Richard. You see it's a large piece. This is the Souvero, that I can tell you. And this was a piece by Michael Heiser. You see his name is right up there. It's nice for it. And so it just shows the fact that one had to really plan out. You know, this was a very weighty piece. So these are the weights these are ABC here to calculate how one could make a platform that the sculpture would stand on. And then this is the Heiser piece, and you can see the fairly big platform that was placed there. Michael Heiser and I had a great argument when I was doing the book, because Holly White, who I'll show you something about in a minute, had shown a photograph of people sitting all over the sculpture. I have to, it's time for me to stop, I'm almost there. And so so I asked permission, because you have to get permission to put photographs, of course, use photographs. And he said, "How dare you show anything of sculpture treated so poorly with people sitting all over?" And I thought, oh dear. In a way, he was right. And so he sent me this photograph, which we've used in the building. And I think that this is Holly White, who made a study of why the plaza worked. And so these were his, it was sort of like bird populations. So he looked at X as female and 0 as male, or the other way around. And so he made these studies, and the people, how they sat around on the plaza. And he talked here about the wetness of the water, that nobody came and told you couldn't put your hands in the water. And this is a photograph that was made just after the Seagram building was completed. You see actually, interestingly, the fountains were originally like this, didn't work at all, so Philip redesigned them in the pool. But you see there was nothing around there, simply nothing. This building, as I said, was removed, and then this world removed. And here's a photograph in 60s, 61 was, I can't remember exactly what the date was. But, you know, the presence of this building is always so strong in its place. And now I will give place to Liz Diller, who will tell you something. I want to tell you just one thing about Liz Diller. I have a photograph of Liz that I just couldn't find. I don't know why I couldn't find it. And it was wonderful. They were building this huge enormous steel cantilever. And it was just in steel. And I was talking to Liz, I don't know if you've noticed, but she has the finest, most delicate fingers in the world. And I just thought this was so incredible. This, this monstrous huge structure. Liz?
Okay. Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you, Mirko, for the invitation to come here. I have to say that watching this makes me really think about that convention when you say, you know, every great piece of architecture requires a great client. In this case, this is so much more than a great client. It's a kind of advocate, a kind of spiritual leader, a collaborator, and then ultimately custodian. And I have never seen as loving a relationship between a building and someone that helped to produce it, you know, to make it happen. You know, today we were chatting about some other things, and Phyllis was complaining about the out of compliance Venetian blinds when she goes by, and so she continues to look at the building and wants to make sure that it's, you know, it's as designed and as envisioned. It's a really beautiful thing. I hope that there are such advocates for our work sometime in the future. I'm going to talk about the Lincoln Center and also the book project. We like to think of architecture or the building as only one manifestation of architecture, where the book and drawings and other kinds of productions are also different kind of manifestations. I'm going to get to this in a second and explain that. So this project, when it was originally built, is the same vintage as Seagram's. I mean, this was initiated in something like 53, 54. conceptual work started on the project in the mid-50s, and it broke ground something like 1959 with the raising of a whole huge site. This is now 16 acres as opposed to one. This is also sort of a super complex campus. When Lincoln Center originally decided to kind of combine all of these cultural institutions into one campus, it was highly controversial regarding centralizing all of these arts into one spot. In any case, 50 years elapsed, and what was yesterday's kind of criminal act is today's synergies, and there are all these kind of interesting things that happen between the institutions now occupying the same site. This just shows the kind of range of different projects that we did all throughout the campus. It was never conceived as a master plan when we were involved. It was more like kind of aggregation of different projects, starting from one corner of the campus, and then kind of like, you start doing a little renovation in your apartment, then all of a sudden, you start fiddling around with the kitchen, and then you start to do something with the baseboards on the other side, and as long as you're, making some dust, you might as well do something else. It's exactly this approach at Lincoln Center. No one ever knew how much it was ultimately going to cost or how big the dreams were going to be, but it just kept growing. So these were the original guys that were responsible for Lincoln Center. And, apparently when this photo was taken, they were no longer talking to each other. It looks like it looks like they were all getting along, but, this is actually just the same time. And I have to say that the guy on the right, Phyllis and I have this disagreement. I think that's Philip Johnson. And Phyllis didn't think, last time we talked about it, you didn't think that was Philip Johnson. We were discussing like what was going on with the hairline, right? And like the cufflinks, and I am sure that that's him, but we can discuss that another time. But these guys, were all representing their own clients, different constituencies. Lincoln Center it's a kind of aggregate of many different bits and pieces, and they only share the same address. And George Balanchine said that that really they only share the central mechanical plant. They actually just are, there are different artistic directors, different general managers, different trustee boards. They fight for the same funding dollars, and when they had their own architects represented at the table, each wanted to do their thing, and they had a hard time collaborating on the site plan and everything else. Anyway, there are a lot of stories to tell, and the book starts to talk about some of them. When we started to work on this and we were selected, I think it was a case of mistaken identity that we were selected. And Phyllis, you're so right. I mean, totally unqualified to do this. I don't know what gave them the idea, but we said something right at some point, I don't know, and we showed them a PowerPoint of ideas, and a lot of them were very far-fetched, but they thought that we kind of hit something, and part of it was that we love this kind of atmosphere at intermission where all the people pour out onto the portico balconies, and the three main venues that face the fountain all are built with this one consciousness of having this, this kind of people space that's outside the buildings, but inside of the porticos facing the fountain. We felt that really worked, and was so, and that could be taken much further. We told them that we'd like to make Lincoln Center that's more Lincoln Center than Lincoln Center, and what we meant was more like this. Actually, Lincoln Center was kind of more like this. This is 65th Street. It's the space between the North and the South Campus. The Millstein Bridge, the plaza, which is making that 200-foot-long shadow, is linking the two sides of the campus, but at the expense of the street. It's very service-oriented. There are truck loading bays under here, but there are also the entrances to some of the significant theaters. Juilliard Theater, Lincoln Center Theater. There was just this great discrepancy. So coming back to what Phyllis calls the podium, I call the plinth. Lincoln Center was conceived in this mega block planning, this 50s kind of notion of banding everything together and elevating the building, but in this case above a central mechanical plant and a garage. So this was a very car-centric site. One of the first things that we thought we'd do and what we showed in our interview was kind of blowing up the plinth and making what's underneath it. And there were other things besides the mechanical plant. There were rehearsal spaces, and there were pieces of the library and lobbies that were behind the stone opaque walls. So this is, actually just underneath that. It was very fast traffic and just kind of nasty, Anyway, it was so car-centric that they actually had a filling station in the garage, which doesn't seem very safe, actually. Anyway, but all of that changed. So I'm going to just show a couple of before and after images. So after you crossed, this is what we inherited. After you crossed 11 lanes of traffic on Columbus Avenue, you went across a little street, and then this greedy little stair that took you to 2 more lanes of traffic. So if you weren't run over before, you had another opportunity to be run over. And then when we got there, it was after 9/11, so Jersey barriers. And it just seemed wrong. So the before and after, what we did was we depressed that access road that was at plaza level. This is kind of another story that Philip Johnson really wanted to bring the traffic very, very close to the venues, and he was part of the master planning, and actually wanted to bring the cars like right in front of each of the venues, very suburban style. But anyway, the patrons wanted to be close to their entrances. We depressed this road and extended the stair across and really made what we felt was a proper gesture at the scale, the monumental scale of the site. But this kind of monumentality was on our terms. So there's the road going below, so it was a very thin stair, basically. And it was dematerialized with electronics. And so on the risers are what's going on that day and a constant program that's shifting. And this stair was really meant to also be a people space that attracts people, and it kind of works. Also, as an extension of the arcades, were these canopies that we designed that were very large cantilevers. I have to say, the last time I made a presentation on the book, and somebody in the audience said that our work when we were doing before Lincoln Center was so interestingly perverse that now that, and Lincoln Center was so calm, like what happened to the perversion of our work, and as a kind of criticism that we were no longer perverse. I just wanted to show you, like, there were a couple of perverse things that I put in this talk. One of them, I just don't have the right image, but this like huge cantilever of glass, all the tension and compression forces are working right through the glass. The steel is coming, the knees of the columns are just joining with glass also, right at that joint. And then as this column goes down, it kind of meets together and ends in a stiletto heel at the concourse level, which I don't have a photograph of. So before and after. Very, very simple change. The water level goes down to the plaza level. The rim is exactly the same diameter, same material, but is now floating and uplit to be very dematerialized, and the fountain itself is computerized and programmed to do various things that water doesn't like to do. And here they're calibrating exactly the height of the water. And some other things, like, for example, Fashion Week, the public spaces, in general, in our estimation, were always conceived of as public spaces for various activities, but were not really very well utilized. And we hope that with the work that we did, with mostly unticketed public in mind, that these spaces would be opened up. And they're also opened up for various kinds of other events. This is Fashion Week. We designed this, which we kind of felt was like the last constituent organization at Lincoln Center. It was the entrance to Fashion Week. And that image at the very beginning that was matching up this fabric travertine to Lincoln Center's serious, real travertine was actually used in this facade. And here we just kind of conjoined the facade with a model. Her name was Nada, and it was a kind of bustier and a skirt that became the stair. And she was mechanized and robotic, and she kind of did a little hip rotation with a lot of attitude. Okay, moving on to the North Plaza. This is the before, very desolate, windswept, and after. A lot of the moves that we made have double meetings at Lincoln Center. Here we had to really make a public green space. At the same time, a destination restaurant, there was just not enough real estate on the site, and so we conjoined the moves and made the green space the roof of the destination restaurant. And there it is, one touchdown point at the North Plaza. So a lot of the stuff at North Plaza was reconfigured, and this was perhaps the most sensitive part of Lincoln Center historically. It was Dan Kiley's landscape that had to be shifted around a bit and reinterpreted. So here is that space. For us, it's a kind of opportunity to make an urban bucolic space that it looks onto the reflecting pool and away from traffic. And this is the space of the restaurant beneath, which is just a glass pavilion with a shaped roof. And then this space is also interpreted, as an open space for congregation for events. And that's the way it is throughout Lincoln Center. All the public spaces are available for all sorts of use that it didn't have before. The previous entrance to Alice Tully Hall, and this is just backing up from that, the Belusky building, which was considered to be the best brutalist building in America. And the before and after. We expanded into this triangular space of Broadway and 65th Street with about 55,000 square feet of Juilliard classrooms and rehearsal spaces in the top 3 floors, and then below expanded Tully and gave it a lobby and box office and cafe. And it was, for us, we kind of characterize this as an architectural striptease. We took all the stone out and we basically made apparent what was already there. Tully Theater was already there. It just, didn't have any street presence. So we glammed it up, also, and designed a lot of interior spaces here. This is, some of this is the joint actually between the new and old travertine. I wonder, Phyllis, whether we got our travertine from the same place. I wonder whether the travertine came from the same place in Italy. But this was donated, like post-war donation, and in some kind of spirit of goodwill. In any case, the floors didn't line up in the new renovation, in the new expansion, and so we took the window punches and we just basically blinded them. And where there were intersections with the new floor and the changed programs, we just simply intersected them where they came, which allowed us to make these prismatic windows. So there's just a million details of this project. I'm just showing a couple. The east elevation is entirely different and sheared on the edge of Broadway, very transparent. the Juilliard students complained, that it was just, they had no connection with the exterior, so we really gave them a lot of transparency. Glass was really pushed to the limit. These are the glass mullions, basically glass fins, that hold up that facade. They're all suspended. The entire glass structure is suspended, and it's suspended in the joints between the glass, the large glass panels. Oh no! What? Just no. What do I do? What do how come I can't do this? No. Okay. I use a Mac. The PC is like just driving me crazy. Okay, just rolling along. This is another curtain wall. This is at Tully with one-way cable system, as transparent as possible. This communication between inside and outside was critical for us to make it as sheer as possible. And you could see the kind of play of symmetry across the outside space, just off the sidewalk, and the inside space. You don't need tickets for either. Tickets are behind my back here, but there's this desire to have a better public interface at Lincoln Center, and then filled with crowds. This is that cable net that is also doing a lot of performance. So glass figures strongly. This is inside of Tully Hall, the way it was before and after. We worked with the bones of the space, we had to, and all of the architecture happened within 18 inches from the structural walls. And there was a total reconfiguration of the acoustics and of the optics, and all the different ways that one could really kind of produce a much better chamber hall that still manages to show films and everything else. A lot of detail here. The way the stage configuration. I want to point out the nose cone where the geometries converge. And this was like one of our obsessions. We couldn't bring it to a point, but we brought it to close to a point because it was a technical impossibility. And this is, unfortunately, this works in Keynote, it doesn't work, but that glow, we were obsessed with this blush, that would come from beyond the wall. So the theater performs just at the beginning of any show. So that should be a blend. Entrance to Juilliard School before and after, all of before it was on the level of the plaza. At the very, very earliest stages, it was on 66th Street, then it moved to a plaza level, and now back down to the street, to 65th Street this time. Again, like reinterpreting the monumental on our terms, and many internal spaces that I won't go into, facilities, transformations for Juilliard. This is an insertion in a really not very good building that was built in the early 90s, the Rose Building, and 16-foot ceilings in these School of American Ballet spaces. They wanted to expand their ballet studios and double the capacity. So we found room in the plenum, and so here we just kind of pushed the mechanicals around, and we're able to nest smaller rehearsal studio inside bigger ones that share the light and share structure. And there is, from a bridge, that space. And the entrance to some of these, Lincoln Kirsten, everything is backwards, Lincoln Center, and only reflected through surfaces to be right reading. Before and after in the street, on 65th Street, now filled with media and kind of reduction of street traffic, expansion of the sidewalks, trees on the other side. And we did everything with the digital media. So this project taught us to kind of conjoin urbanism, architecture, information systems, landscape, and so forth. And this is the new bridge that is now only 10 feet wide, but still needs to bring the two parts of the campus together. This is just very quickly the organizational chart showing us in the middle, of course. These are all of Lincoln Center's constituents. Of course, they have to have unanimity to make any decision on campus. There are 12 of them. And then all of the stakeholders on the left side, which include a city task force and all the city commissioners, and everybody else, and all the people below are all the people that we worked with, our executive architects, projects that we did on our own, all the consultants. And each of these can expand into more. I think after we did this project, we felt we could do anything else in the world. It took like almost 10 years. So we felt like we could do anything else until we met Eli Broad. And then, we're doing this project for one man in Los Angeles, a billionaire, and it's just as hard. Anyway, the book, and just very, very quickly, the book is made out of gatefolds. It's entirely out of gatefolds. It has a very unusual structure. So you open up and you see full bleed photos all over the place. It's like an architecture porno book, and you open it up and then there's a diary inside and it tells you all those backstories. And it kind of goes like that, just to show you a couple of them. Okay. And I think that's it, and let's chat. Okay, somebody can put it on to black. Whoop.
Well, I have some questions to ask Liz. Mirko, aren't you supposed to be organizing our... Somebody has to sort of say to anybody who wants to ask a question, yes, you may ask a question, or something like that.
Okay, first we chat.
Okay, first we chat.
Yeah.
Oh, this is our device. Yeah, I think that... How did you get to the point from, the very first things you were doing? It was basically 65th Street, and Alice Tully entrance, I guess it was that. How did all these other pieces get added on? How did, you sort of said that, first of all you have, your dining room and then the kitchen and, all these little things. Okay, how did that happen?
Yeah, so we were originally hired to do the 65th Street and public spaces because it was, they thought of us, Rebecca Robertson felt that we did this really interesting media project on 42nd Street.
On 42nd Street, yep.
Yeah.
We had the big mouth.
The big mouth.
And she understood that you really understood where the place was and what the conditions were.
And she also thought that we could bring media to the public space, which in a certain way, it's very interesting that because there's so much activity in the venues, but the public spaces are totally mute, as well as the streets are mute. So the idea was maybe electronically we could turn the Lincoln Center inside out. Well, what happened was we started to work on the public spaces. There was a budget, I think, of like a $50 million budget to do North Plaza and the street. And as we started to work, there were ideas about on the north side of the site to maybe look at the box office of Alice Tully Hall. And we looked at the box office, and then we thought, well, how could you expand the box office? Juilliard was going to expand. Well, should we look at that as well? Well, we were not ones to, cough up more work, but somehow there was an interest in us taking a look at the expansion of Juilliard. So then we were doing the expansion of Tully, the Tully box office and lobby and Juilliard, and then they thought, well, all of a sudden, the hall is going to look like, we put all our money into the lobby and the outside, shouldn't we put it into the inside where the artists are? So they asked us to do the inside. Meanwhile, we were doing the public spaces, and the South constituents, which are the Metropolitan Opera, the Philharmonic, New York State Theater, the two constituents there, they didn't want any part of the redevelopment. And they just thought, okay, you're going to do the north part of the campus, fine, we don't need you. And then they looked at what was going on the north side and said, well, you know, maybe you should tell us what we could do on the south side. So they were envious of what was happening to the north. All of a sudden, they seemed shabby. So it was with no program. And then we started to look at, you know, the condition at Columbus Avenue and the expansion. All of that and the plaza came out of that. Meanwhile, School of American Ballet asked if we would do their little studios. And you know, at this point, we were so full of work. Our studio had gone from 12 people to like 50-something people. And we thought, there's no way we could take on a little renovation like that with 2 studios. But they convinced us to do it. We did it. And it
I remember, yeah.
At the very end, that was the last thing we took on. It was the first thing to be opened. And it was just like that. It was an organic growth that came out of a sense, I think, of the client not having the vision initially, not really understanding that what was good for the campus was good for their box office. Later, they started to see that this is actually good for all constituents individually, and started to come along. And then, of course, interiors and all of that came out.
Yeah, I remember your agony about that. I remember we'd go out to dinner, and you'd come out from a meeting, you know, and they're not going to do the hall, and just not going to do the hall. And Rick would say, Elizabeth, now calm down.
Well, it's true. I think that,
It was hell.
For us, it was hell. It was like a total maturing, you know, experience for our studio. The thing that I like to kind of repeat often is that, the cliche, the 99% perspiration to 1% inspiration. That's how I felt going into this thing. It was crazy. There were like hundreds and hundreds of meetings, like your meeting, you know, with all of this,
right.
all of that testosterone in the room, you know.
Men in suits.
It was meeting after meeting after meeting, convincing people, and I just kept thinking about like that 1% of inspiration, and I realized someplace along year 5 that 99% took as much creativity as the 1% to turn all those brains around, to get consensus, to get the city to agree, to get the funders to.
It's mind-boggling actually to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's a talent that I never knew I had, and a patience that I never knew I had. But in the end, I think that it was just a huge learning curve. And if we had known then what we got to know later, we would have never.
But you never. That's always true of everything. I love what Reynold Levy, who was the president of Lincoln Center, he said, usually you get, star architects. There were star architects who were major architects anyway, who had lots of big buildings they did, and they didn't get the project you did. But he said that usually, they'd come in, they have one person who come once a week or maybe once a month, and that's all you'd ever see of the architect. And he said, Liz was there all the time, the persistence, she was always there, and they devised a way of trying to get a vacation for you and Rick so that they could go on with things without you. Of course they couldn't. But
they couldn't.
Well, with that persistence, that is absolutely, if you're not there the whole time, it's just, it's not going to work.
It wouldn't work. But just on that theme, just to ask you a question, when you stepped into this project and you stopped that site from being developed the way that it was going to be developed, and you said, no, you gotta really get a good architect involved, and then you got yourself into the center of all of that with all those people. There must have been a healthy amount of naivete when you started, and
completely.
So how did that all, for you, how did that evolve as this thing was becoming a huge responsibility and something other?
Well, you're just there, and you've got to deal with things. Mm-hmm. And you know what has to happen, you know what's right. And so, you don't think about it. I mean,
you just learn along the way.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
And then if you have somebody that John Handy was, very helpful, because I'd go and pull my hair out, and he'd say, no. But, it's people have asked me, well, how could you have, dealt with all those people, without knowing anything? And I said, well, you just knew. You had something that had to be done. You knew it had to be done. And you just did it.
Yeah. I think that's true. That if you knew more, you wouldn't have been able to do it. And kind of, I mean,
Absolutely.
I think the same. You know, for us, it was our naivete that drove everything, because I think the clients kind of picked up that there was this incredible sincerity and belief in the work, and people were more apt to cooperate when they really feel you're on the line. You're not trying to talk them into something. You're not trying to seduce them. You're just really, doing this from the heart, and everything matters. And you've got your hands in everything.
And somehow that it kind of emanates.
Yeah, I think it makes people really kind of jump in there and try to see your vision somehow through your brain.
Mies had something interesting to say about that, because when I was later on in Chicago, and I used to go to his house for dinner. I was actually working in his office for a while, and there was the time when the parity came there were two very young researchers. I think one was at Columbia and one was somewhere else, and they developed this idea of parity, that at a certain point in the huge universe thing, that parity would either come or not come. I can't quite remember what it was. And so he said, it's only young people can do that. He said, because they don't know what not to do.
Yeah, exactly. You kind of, you need a little bit of knowledge. But you also need a little.
You need a little. You need a little. The knowledge. You have to have a knowledge of what you're working with, of the field of the ideas that have generated things. The technical knowledge you learn.
You learn it, yeah.
And somebody said to me, there's that woman who runs the building museum in New York. And she said, well, how does Mies deal with all these technical things of, in building New York? And I said, well, he just asks basic questions. Yeah. What's the size of the smallest office? What is the elevator? What are the zoning rules?
Right.
But people muddle things up with so much over information, I think.
Yeah.
Well, the wrong kind, anyway.
When Mies did that, I mean, I would like to see the group of consultants that were there at the time, because this is an era of specialization. So for Lincoln Center, we had 20 consultants. One for acoustics, one for building facades. All of that stuff.
While dealing with those people all the time.
And it's all that list of people. And so from our end, you just go to the experts. You ask the experts, and they have a stake in this too. But when you're a generalist, and you're trying to do everything comprehensively, it's different. It's a different time. And I think that the role of the architect now is more like a film director. You have the big vision, and then you get, you pull in a lot of talent. And it's very, very collaborative.
But it always has been, really.
It always has been. Actually, this is one of the opportunity for us to talk about all the kind of converging things between these projects made me really think a little bit, more about what was at the fulcrum between us and, this time frame, Philip Johnson. And I was thinking a lot about collaboration of Mies and Johnson, and and there are many things. Just one thing from my end, and this is going to be followed up with a question for you, but this was a moment when Johnson had had been departing. When he came to Lincoln Center, he was departing from modernism.
He had been for some time.
Yeah.
He had been since '53 when he did the interior of his brick house.
Okay. But he was helping to realize the Seagrams on Mies's terms, right? I mean, there was so much there that was also of Johnson's.
There was the rigor of Mies, and there was he could do that wonderful interior of the Four Seasons within the space and the language that Mies had created. And Philip had a kind of sense of drama, and especially lighting, and that was something in the books. Nobody's ever discussed Philip and lighting,
But I find that in the book I learned many things about all the interiors pieces that Johnson did.
Yes.
And this is a kind of Well, it's an interesting way to think about. I've never thought about the Seagram that way. The public
You've never thought about what?
The Seagram building. The public perception, or in the architectural perception, was that Philip Johnson enabled. Was a kind of more of an enabler, and he was there and he assisted and took the architect of record and so forth. But I didn't realize just how much design he had done there. And
well, he did the lighting of the building, the lighting of the tower, the luminous ceiling. It was Mises' idea to have the offices lit, but he didn't know how. And Philip did the Four Seasons.
Right.
And then he did the Seagram offices.
Did he do the hardware?
Hardware,
and
yes.
And the partitions.
Well, Philip was at the Museum of Modern Art when I was talking to people about who would make the most sense, who would do the work that would really be important for everybody, that would really set the standards in some way on Park Avenue. And Philip was still at the Department of Design, but he was head of, the Department of Design, Museum of Modern Art, was, was kitchen stoves and glasses. I mean, design, drawings, architecture, never existed until Mies gave his drawings, and Frank Lloyd Wright did too. But, so Philip came, he understood that it was going to be Mrs. Building. I mean, and that the whole idea of the structure and of the concept, but he wanted to make it a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk in which everything was, so he wanted to work with the industry and make all the things like the faucets in the bathrooms, the blinds for the building, the ceiling, of course, that came later. So that was his sort of first take at it. And then when Mies went back to Chicago, because he couldn't get a license in New York, because he couldn't prove that he had a proper high school degree. And he was so insulted, he went back to Chicago. And so Philip, took over the lighting thing. And then, actually, as far as the Four Seasons, he said, Mies gave it to me. I think Mies, it was a very complex problem, and Philip did it brilliantly, there's no question about it. But it was really kind of he wanted to do industrial standards. See, that's what he wanted to do, improve the industrial standards.
And I find that really, really interesting that at the time that this kind of design was happening within the building's core and shell, right? And it was very well done relative to a kind of Miesian, I guess Philip Johnson's Miesian period, right?
He'd already broken it from, but he had to, of course, keep within it.
He kept going, but meanwhile, his moral compass
Yes.
was going like this way, and Lincoln Center was a real demonstration of this, parting of, like a real demonstration of parting away from modernism. I mean, you could see, and it's so interesting to see how that group of architects, went ahead and did the planning of the public spaces and the organization of the buildings and the kind of monumental modernism, I guess it was called. That was one of the things it was called. But and the Campidoglio references and all the historic,
Philip,
all of that stuff, the New York State Theater, all the historic allusions.
Well, the whole system of the arcades, and of course Philip wanted to pull that around the whole front and make a open arcade just to complete that.
So this was like an interesting
But I think it's because
moment.
Philip was so much more. He was much more educated about architecture than the others were. They were all.
Right.
Arrow Saarinen, I mean, he knew something about architecture, but basically it was craft and it was pulling up your sleeves.
Right.
Are we being told something?
We have just a few minutes if you want. And then
Okay. But yeah, okay.
Yeah, but like already Alto and Breuer left this group. They were in the original Lincoln.
I know that
Center
Breuer
group.
was, but they found him too
And
difficult.
Alto also. Well, I think that their idea about modern architecture didn't comply with the other group, which was drifting toward historical illusion.
Postmodernism, yeah.
Yeah. although Gordon Bunshaft stayed and Saarinen, and Belusky. So there was, there were
but they were off to the sides.
They were off to the north. They did their own thing, and it's really interesting how north and south really was divided. But I find that interesting. In making the book, did you rethink some of those relationships between Mies and Johnson?
Absolutely. Making the book, I started, well, first of all, I did Mies in America. And that, I learned a lot about Mies in doing that. I mean, we were sort of looking for somebody to do something, but nobody understood a thing about Mies, and I talked to people and they had no idea. So I decided that since I was an architect and I understood pretty well what Mies was doing, I would go into it and really use all the documentation and do research on it. So by the time I got to this book, I had that under my belt, and so I always had the idea that I wanted to do a book on the Seagram building because I'd been there the whole time. It would be ridiculous not to. But I was doing the CCA, and so it took some time. And I gave a series of lectures. So I always had the idea of going from, what was the situation in New York at that time, and then of course what the site look for the search for the site and all that sort of stuff. But I did a lot of research. I suppose in each particular part of it, and then I suppose at the landmarking, I don't think I gave a lectures on. As I got further onto it, I was already, writing a lot of other stuff for the book. And then after I worked on it for 12 years. But it was just, I'd give a lecture and I was doing other things. I was still head of the CCA at that point. And so I then, by 2001, I had retired as head of the CCA. And Mirko was not there yet, but I did. And then I just, gave these lectures. And then I started to, after about 4 or 5 years, I just really wrote, improving all the chapters, doing the research that was needed about finding out what the area was like, and all of these things. But I had terrific archives myself, and the Seagram archives were great too.
But did your understanding of the dynamic, the
Oh,
Mies Johnson
completely.
dynamic, change while you were doing this?
As far as Philip was concerned, I always thought didn't matter he was there or not.
Yeah.
And I thought it would be nice. It was nice that there were the standards for the lettering and the door handles and the bathroom taps and even the connections of the toilets to the wall and things like that. But I didn't take him seriously really, and it was only as I realized when I did that lecture, I did that for Barry Bergdahl at Columbia, the lecture on Philip and Light, and that was terrific. I really understood where he was coming from. He used to go around talking about par 37, par 37. Nobody ever knew that. So I said, well, what was that about? So it was that whole thing at Yale and the great theater man who taught the lighting. The man who did the lighting had went to school to architecture to find out how to treat light in a glass building. That's a hard thing to know. So that was fascinating. So yes, and I learned about a lot of things in doing that. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been much fun.
Yeah, it's another project.
Yeah.
Yet another project.
So I'm sorry, it's a unpleasant role to interrupt this conversation, but perhaps we have some minutes for some questions that could perhaps bring the conversation to other points that have been missed till now. I don't know if there is any question, otherwise, yes, please.
It takes a while to get that. I can never hear, so if you will tell me what to say. Can you hear? I can never hear a
The other
question.
way.
I think the mic isn't on. Oh?
Technology.
It's a kind of a Miesian question.
Yes. Very minimal.
Bonsoir. Donc, j'ai beaucoup entendu. Je vais poser ma question en français. Est-ce que c'est correct? Quelqu'un pourrait traduire, peut-être. J'ai beaucoup entendu parler de dématérialisation, aussi d'espaces vides devant les bâtiments, de réflexion des bâtiments par rapport à des vitrines, de l'intérieur et l'extérieur qui devenaient beaucoup plus fluides. Je me demandais si c'est un nouveau courant en architecture dans ces années-là d'avoir comme un retrait de l'architecte ou un retrait sur la ville pour laisser plus de place au vide. Est-ce que c'est une tendance en architecture de cette époque-là? Puis, est-ce que c'est une tendance qui a été initiée par Miss Van der Rohe et par le Lincoln Center? Je veux justement peut-être parler du parallèle qu'il peut y avoir entre l'art visuel et l'architecture. Est-ce que à New York, à cette époque-là, les architectes étaient préoccupés par cette tendance donc de dématérialisation puis de retrait de la personnalité de l'architecte?
What was your question? I'm sorry, I have difficulty hearing.
Can you translate?
So-
Can you translate?
Can you translate?
No, don't
Madame,
ask me that.
So I'm just asking if, because I heard several times in your discussion, in your presentation of the building, you spoke about dematerialization a lot. You spoke about reflection of the windows, like the windows are not showing the inside of the building, they are showing the reflection of others' building. You were also speaking about space that the architect could have taken on the street, but they leave the space empty. So I'm just asking if at this time in the architectural project, it was important to leave spaces for emptiness, because I think that in the 60s at this time in New York, it was very important in the visual art, which is more my knowledge. So I just want to know if there were a real willing of giving more space to the public spaces, and if le retrait de l'architecte, le retrait de la personnalité est quelque chose de récurrent en architecture à cette période-là.
Okay, I'm going to try to decode a little bit. I don't speak French, so the one part that I can respond to is that for Lincoln Center, speaking on for Lincoln Center, our interest was in removing the stone, right? Removing the stone from the buildings at the base, this podium, and producing a kind of two-way system, looking in and looking out. And it wasn't so much for us about reflection. I think for the Seagram is more about the glass and reflection. But for us, it was really to animate the interface between the building and the city. And the spaces that are unprogrammed, essentially the public spaces, were just what we did was we added infrastructure, we added shade, we added some soft materials, we moved some things around. But not everything is programmed. It's left to be interpreted. But one thing I wanted to say that kind of relates a little bit to your question, I think, when we were in the middle of the design of the North Plaza, which was by far the most sensitive part. Now, nobody cared that we did anything to the Juilliard building. It didn't seem to matter. It was on the historic register. But because we touched the Dan Kiley landscape, there's this big advocacy for the preservation of landscape, which is really great. I mean, you know, somebody needs to do that. The problem was that we were on the side, we were pushed to the side of advocating for the publicness of public spaces, and which meant that we had to affect this historical landscape. And part of the reasoning was that it also didn't really hold up. The landscape didn't hold up. It was dead. It was changed over multiple times. But in the discussions with the Municipal Art Society and Docomomo and the preservationist groups, the argument was against what I was saying, to make good on the publicness of public spaces. The argument was some spaces, of the 50s and 60s were meant to be desolate and should be preserved as desolate. And it was really, I think it was a really interesting provocation. I understood that, that those photos of, one person in the plaza with a de Chirico shadow, that was 50 feet long. There's some really beautiful, these minimalist spaces that, they change totally, when they're filled with people and purpose and all of that. So I don't know, I'm just taking that, I don't know, that wasn't the intention of your question, but the notion of emptiness of these spaces, the moment that you kind of enable many things to happen, people will interpret it and you don't have to overprogram.
Well, that whole question of preservation, it was interesting, didn't exist, of course, when we were doing this Seagram building, let's see, 1961, I guess, they wanted to tear down that fantastic station, the Pennsylvania station. God, it was glorious. It was glorious. It was fantastic. And great glass and steel structure. And Ada Louise Huxtable, who was really the first writer on preservation things in the New York Times, said there's no way to stop it. And there was no way to stop it. And so the preservation law came in. And that, of course, for the Seagram building was very important, to be able to take a building like that and to be able to have regulations that preserve it. We had put in draconian preservations before that the building could be landmarked, because the building had been sold in the meantime, and Seagram was not didn't own it. But that worked very, very, very well. So, but of course, after 50 years later, or 40 years later, those issues are very problematic, and we face them here in Montreal. Every city faces them all the time. And but of course, the question of your intention was a very big difference.
Yeah. I mean, there was a real public intention. So people, the politics of everyone, were kind of teased by this, because on the one hand, you want to do the right thing, you want to also operate in the kind of socio-political context that you're in, if there's really a good, there's a really good purpose. But it just, I wanted to touch on one thing that we haven't touched on, which was we did our first architectural project, one of our first architectural projects in the Seagram building. And it was, that's where we met
the Brasserie restaurant.
The Brasserie, which was in the podium, actually. And, it was really ironic that we get a chance to do something in like the greatest glass and steel building, but it's in a place in the kind of stone base where there's absolutely no connection with the street and no light. So you go into the basement, down some steps, and it was a Philip Johnson design space. And
not great, not his best.
Whatever. and Phyllis had, as part of, she had the kind of guardianship of the whole, of all of Seagram. And when we did, what happened was who was it?
Restaurant Associates.
Nick Valenti, right? Nick Valenti, Restaurant Associates, right?
Yes,
Restaurant Associates basically operated the space, and there was a fire in the space, and it was vacant for
a long
many
time.
years. And then they commissioned an architect to actually do the renovation. And then it went to Phyllis. It was, I think, in construction documents at the time. Went to Phyllis, and Phyllis said, "Over my dead body."
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that, because the major Article 26 of the lease on the building, which controlled everything you could do to the building, said Seagram's good name was what Seagram was concerned about, like you're concerned about people in Lincoln Center, okay? Seagram's good name. And I didn't say over my dead body. I said, this is not in Seagram's interest.
Okay. You must have said that to me. You must have said that to me privately. But anyway, so Phyllis suggested 3 different architects, and we were among the 3. And you know, when we
It was a
came
little
in,
bit loaded by choice, but anyway.
it was loaded. But you know, we made a presentation to the operator, and our only experience in doing restaurants were we like to eat, and so that's what we told them. And then somehow we got the commission, and then our client was more or less Phyllis, because they didn't want to make a step without Phyllis's consent. So our first presentation on the rehabilitation of that space was to Phyllis. And
Well, you said something about that in the film that Terry. Anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Phyllis now you wanted to do something at the Lincoln Center as a kind of
That would be great.
feedback. Okay, we have a short
Look,
question
Michel.
and a short answer. That
Yeah, it's in a way it's in line with what you just said, that the Seagram building is an achievement.
I
in
can't hear a thing, so I'm
I
coming
said
close.
that the Seagram building is an achievement in itself. But my question is, first, what did it change for the company? How did the company recognize the impact of the building on their own business? And my second question is, how did it change or transform your relationship with your father?
How did it change?
Your relationship with your father, if that's not too personal, because basically you went against his sort of taste.
Well, the company, you know, when things happen, you take them for granted. First of all, when my father had agreed that Mies would do the building, and he said, oh, they're not going to approve at all. He said, they're not going to pay. He said, but they'll come around to it. Of course, he was just sort of projecting his own sense of how he was doing it. He bought into it immediately. He and Mies met, and they just took a measure of each other and respected each other, you know. So that was it. And my relationship to my father? Well, as far as my father was concerned, girls didn't exist. You know, they were supposed to get married and have children and, you know, all that stuff. And so I think there was some level of respect that was built. You know, that I was actually able to do this. He never said, you do it, but he never said, don't do it. You know, so he sort of acceded to the thing. And I think it was because the whole process, there was nobody who had an idea. And he was a man who lived on ideas. He just lived on he believed that business he was doing something, you know, there was a sort of a great romance to being in business. And so if you have that sort of an attitude, you know, it's not just oh well, hum, we'll make some money. And so when I came with an idea, you know, I wrote that 8-page letter, or 6-page letter, whatever it is, and you know, I surely had an idea of what was important, and I think that, and then of course there was the backing up of Lou Crandall, who you know, somebody who was well experienced, but I think it was that I was able to project an idea that opened up something for him, the way you opened up all those stories you told just now about how, you know, the people on the south side of the plaza said, oh dear, well, you know, I mean, I think it's that sort of thing. You open up people's ability to see things differently.
But I think, you know, from what I understand reading the book, you know, reading parts of the book so far, is that when you were in Paris, you were doing your thing, and then you came back to New York, and it was a moment at which it was more than an idea. You actually shepherded this whole process through.
But I came back with an idea.
You came back with an idea, but it was more. You actually worked through this thing. You directed the planning of this project.
Oh no, I was just talking about the very first acceptance.
Right.
And then after that, when I pushed through to be able to, yes, I remained. I was anything that happened to the building until 2001, when Seagram Company disappeared, I had something to say about.
But your father must have, I mean, this is like the personal relationship, because I like both of those questions were really good questions. I mean, you know, you don't have to answer them, but it seems very clear that you know, on the one hand, you were the daughter in Paris doing an art thing. The next point, you were directing this project. You were directing the planning of this project for many, many years. So it's like it's like a total brain spin, you know, that happened. You know, in the time that you had this idea to enacting it and pushing the whole thing through, I think was
He would just say blood counts.
But the other thing, I just wanted to follow up on the other, because I'm also very, very interested in what happened with the Seagram brand. You know, that the company had a certain reputation. It builds this building, which is
Changed
this
everything.
major
Changed
architectural
everything.
statement.
But you know, at the time Seagram was being built, there was a great nervousness because the Kefauver Committee on Crime was roaring through. It was on the radio, I mean on the television every day, on radio obviously. And the liquor business, whiskey business, as you know, there was a certain amount of hanky-panky going along. You know, bottles somehow went from Canada to the United States. And so there was a question of, you know, this was brought up. And actually, whiskey company, as here in Montreal, it was just not thought of very well. Well, it wasn't so much Montreal, it was in Canada. In the kind of, Quebec was always much more interested in cultural ideas and eating and drinking and things like that. The rest of Canada was a little bit stiff upper lip. But it really was you know, there was a prejudice against it. And they were very afraid that at one point that people wouldn't want to come into the building. So it just changed the whole perception of Seagram.
So architecture really does make a difference, commercially.
Sometimes.
Well, Frank Lloyd Wright, there was a man who worked in the company who was married to Frank Lloyd Wright's niece, or who was in films actually. And so my uncle, my father's brother, actually was in contact with him. And Frank Lloyd Wright wrote a letter, which is wonderful in the book. And he said, you know, I will build you a building that you will get millions of dollars of advertising value out of it. So, you know, this was pretty well understood by Wright, you know.
That's interesting. That's not a good place to end this.
No.
By the way. Somebody has to say something aspirational.
Have a nice
So perhaps you have to find something perhaps more related to food or to something that you feel more sincere about.
Well, somebody can ask, why did the Seagram Plaza work and the Lincoln Center
How does the
didn't work?
Seagram Plaza work? And
Well, yeah, at that time.
We were discussing that a little bit, yeah.
You know, we were discussing, you know, the Seagram Plaza was, because it was just the flow off the street, and the building produced a pocket of air, like a real physical, palpable void. And it was really, you know, something along Park Avenue that was very, very different. And I think that just kind of produces a kind of vacuum, and it makes people come off the street and from the building into that space. The public spaces at Lincoln Center were just like really alienating and desolate.
Well, that roadway going in front of the steps.
That produced the first fence. I think the cost of tickets, everything around Lincoln Center said, do not come in.
What?
Do not come in. Everything. And it was, you know, frankly, it was when it was designed and built in the West Side, it was very defensive.
Yeah.
And it was elitist. And the notion of the plinth in that case was a kind of elitist move. You know, like bringing art into this kind of rarefied domain off of the abject street.
Yes, but in Seagram it was not, you see. The fact that the building was 3 steps up from the street you know, there were very gradual there were great steps, but actually brought you a little bit away from the madding crowd and the rushing cars. So why did that happen at Seagram's? And well, because you never could flow into Lincoln Center. You had that roadway that brought you in, and then those mean little steps. They were very mean.
Yeah.
And
but both of these sets of structures had to sit on flatness, and they were both on sites that had topography.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So you start with that, and
right.
you know, it's you know, inevitable that you would have a plinth anyway. So the question is how to articulate it at the point of tangency, closest tangency with the street. And I think the Seagram building does it with with a lot of elegance, you know, and it's a very small wall
But I'd like to say something else about it, though. I think that Seagram building, the thing I really learned, one of the things, somebody asked me what I learned, or you asked me, and I learned about, when I first thought about the plaza, I said, it's like a parvis in front of a church. But that wasn't it at all, and Barry had started off the importance for me of the building and garden, building and plaza, building and, you know, in the city was huge. And that when he was even before he was even working, the idea, Schinkel's great gardens and the relationship of the house to the gardens. And if you see that first in the book, I showed the first house he did when he was 20 years old. And from the garden side, it really looks like the Seagram building in a way. I mean, it's neoclassical in its thing. And so that there was this, he had an idea. He had an idea that you make a place where you can move around in, and there's a trajectory and a movement. And even his mullions add to that sense of movement, you know, because as you move, the building is sculptured, it changes. And so that all works together. And so he really had that sense. And I think what happened at Lincoln Center is Philip had an idea of this is what it was like in neoclassical times. And so it was an imposition of an idea that was from something. It wasn't an idea that grew out. It was an imposition of an idea that grew from examples that one could see around. It was an emulation in a way.
It's interesting because they just one thing, you know, what you said before was earlier today was that the building was pushed back so that Mies could feel like there was space to see the building, you know, the elevation of the building, which you couldn't do if the building was up against the street. That's another kind of interesting.
I'm sorry, it's very difficult to stop this enchanting conversation, but
we'll
there are some time constrictions. So, first of all, thank you very much. And it was a very nice insight view of two buildings, two places, and a little bit of two books. We have now both Phyllis and Liz in the bookshop for a few minutes for signing some books. So I would like to thank all of you, Liz and Phyllis, these two young architects, for the two nice books and the two nice stories of what is behind these two spaces in New York. Thank you again.
Thank you.